In our last lecture together, we looked at Hegel's extraordinary conception of history. And in terms of that conception, there's really a narrative. Hegel thinks he has given a rational account of history. It's not Kant's austere account, but it's a notion of history as having a story to it. And we can come to know what that story is. And Hegel also says nothing great happens without passion. That is to say, it is also passion and the embrace of conflict and struggle that has moved history along. Unlike the Romantics, who are less concerned about history and more concerned about the idiosyncratic, Hegel thinks Hegel has taken the creative and the passionate and fused them with the rational, and out of that we really have a story to tell. And it is, in fact, God's autobiography, the coming to full consciousness of the divine life. And maybe that life has been complete and nothing can be added to it, but Hegel thinks that it can be recapitulated. Well, that's not going to be possible for everybody. There may have been creative spirits who did it. There may be great statespeople who created stable contexts in which that kind of life could be lived. But what about what I'll call, hesitantly, normal people, such as perhaps you and me, certainly me? We're not the creative ones. We're not necessarily altogether fully going to be able to understand all its ins and outs. What is our life then going to be like? And what Hegel tells us is that we need to reflect on the way government is, the way states are, and the extent to which freedom can be found within the context of life lived today in a state. Hegel's account of human life and the inner nature of human life isn't just understood as what he's called absolute spirit, coming to full and articulate awareness of itself. He also understands history as the development and the difficult journey to complete human freedom. Not just a grand story of the unfolding of the life of the divine, but it can also be, even in our time, the notion that we too can become, in our time, fully free. But what does that mean? Well, let's consider. There's a problematic notion in Hegel. It involves a personal transition, an historical one that bears close attention. It involves a perilous challenge. It involves a transition. The German word for it is Übergang, and that has to be understood as a very perilous transition that, if Hegel is right, is part of the meaning of life. Part of the meaning of life, the journey toward the meaning of life, involves embracing, looking right in the face of extraordinary difficulties, fundamental conflicts, conflicts that we must somehow find a way to get beyond. And Hegel thinks if we live with full passion and we are committed to embracing the conflicts that we face, we will find a way to move beyond them, not avoid them, but move beyond them. We can never predict in advance how this will be done, but it can be done, and it would involve in a certain way a kind of courageous leap, not knowing for sure what will be on the other side. What Hegel does tell us is that on the journey of life, having gone through such a transition, we can in fact look back retrospectively and we can see that there's a story that can be told about the transition that we make. Hegel is very strange in this way. Hegel has the notion that as we live life forward, we cannot know in advance, as we embrace wholeheartedly conflict and contradiction, we cannot know in advance how we can move through to the other side of it. And that will involve an element of uncertainty. This is one of the great, fascinating, dangerous notions in Hegel. But Hegel also claims that on the other side, we can look back and there will always be a story we can tell in retrospect that will say, what we did made sense. It is part of a thread of development. We couldn't have anticipated in advance that we would land where we've landed, but in retrospect, it makes great sense. Is the journey of life the embracing of such conflicts and having to undergo such transitions? And is it a story that is always a good story? Hegel says there will always be irredeemably negative elements in any story we tell that is the story of our lives. But these negative elements we have to absorb, because our life is not just everything that happens. Our life and the meaning of our life is the story that we can tell about it as a narrative. As a narrative that allows us to say, here is how it has happened, and there's a way to explain my journey, a way to explain my journey that makes sense of it. The journey I've made may have involved agonies, difficulties, sacrifices, but it was not for nothing. There's a story that can be told about it. And to live a life that allows a story of this sort to be told about it, that's what the journey of life is about. In important ways, that's what the meaning of life is. Hegel has some unusual, perhaps even extraordinary things to say about death. He understands death as a metaphor for spiritual transition. You could say, as many have said, that the problem isn't, and it wasn't for Hegel, whether there's a life after death. The question is there a life after birth? Is it possible that we can be dead within this life? And if we are dead within this life, how does this happen? What does it mean? What Hegel tells us is that we can be deadened within situations that perhaps we don't understand, and we step back and experience confusion that we don't try to resolve. Hegel also says that we can be deadened by being caught up in socio-political circumstances that perhaps even if we understand them, we feel stalemated and locked in by them. Or we can be dead in a way that isn't just simply a matter of understanding, not simply a matter of socio-political circumstances that imprison us. We could also be locked in such a way that we could say it's a kind of existential agony. And Hegel says that if we can see, experience, allow ourselves to understand that we may have been deadened, then maybe we can open ourselves. We can embrace the circumstance or situation in which we have found ourselves deadened. And by bringing that situation to life and courageously and wholeheartedly living with it, we will bring ourselves to life. This is a dynamic notion in Hegel. The notion that many lives, many lives are lived in a deadened and an anesthetized way. Many lives are locked in by conventions, but also by conflicts that are deep and not understood. And therefore we live a kind of death in life. And what he wants us to do is open ourselves, live in a wholehearted way that will embrace what may otherwise have stymied and stifled us and opened us up to our future. This is at the heart of the work of the early Hegel. What we have to understand is that Hegel not only talks about the whole of history, as the history of the human spirit understood as the unfolding of the divine life, Hegel is also prepared and talks about the journey of life as our individual histories. And those histories can be lived in at least two ways. We can live a history that allows us to see the past and experience imaginatively what it meant, but there could also be the history of living forward into the future, not avoiding conflict, but being open to it, and open to it in a way that allows us to absorb it and transcend it. Let's keep track as we go forward that after Hegel, a lot of people are going to say, but that's just a dream. How few people could do that. Hegel is just talking to the extraordinary individual. Could we possibly understand the journey of life toward meaning to be looking at our lives as if, and perhaps it would be true, we're caught up in dead-end situations, that underlying them there are conflicts, and that we have somehow to open up ourselves to these situations, that we have to try to go beyond them? Doesn't that sound all too grand? Hegel seems to have two problems then for us. Hegel has a notion of history as the big story, but here we are. And Hegel has a notion of passionate, courageous individuals. Passionate, creative individuals, courageous, who just embrace life, live it to the full, take on, come to understand conflict, and creatively go beyond it. But is this possible? Well, if it's possible, we'd at least have to be free. And Hegel's notion of what it is to be free is very close to his understanding of the French Revolution. He discusses the French Revolution in his early work, in a work called The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is published in 1807. And he discusses the French Revolution in a part of this work called Freedom and Terror. Freedom and terror. He thinks that freedom and terror tell us a lot about the French Revolution. He also thinks freedom and terror, properly understood, well, they tell us a lot about our individual lives. Unusual circumstances surrounded Hegel's writing of the Phenomenology of Spirit and the section on freedom and terror. At this time, Napoleon was coming through the city where Hegel was writing his book. And Hegel looked out his window, saw Napoleon, and said to a friend, "We've just seen the world spirit riding through on horseback." Odd. But you see, this was Hegel's sense of things, that there are people that move history, but they could also be ordinary people as you just looked at them. There's a man on a horse. But at the same time, Hegel thought, that man on the horse, warts and all, is one of those who is moving history. And Hegel's own situation was equally problematic. Not that not that Napoleon's was that problematic, but Hegel's situation was that he had a publisher's deadline to meet. How to put this delicately, a young woman was pregnant and Hegel would be the father, and he was pressured by the publisher, and the fighting was going on, and what to do. And Hegel said that, well, that's sort of the way history is. You're caught up in immediate particular circumstances that could overwhelm you, and at the same time you have a purpose and something that you're meant to do. And these things get scrambled together. And the important thing in human life is to know what does matter and what doesn't matter. And this actually would take us back to something we talked about before. Maybe that Hegel would be a father. Maybe that there is a publisher's deadline. Maybe these things mattered too. But on Hegel's account, what really mattered was the development of spirit, the life of ideas, so that finally what mattered was the book. The book was what really mattered. Now, with regard to the French Revolution, which Hegel wrote about in this section called Freedom and Terror, Hegel says that institutions are important, very important. We need political and social institutions, but we need them in a particular way. Political and social institutions must be of such a sort that they acknowledge our needs as human beings, they speak to those needs, and we feel thereby acknowledged and recognized. We must be surrounded by institutions that recognize us as human beings. But quickly, Hegel tells us, that isn't really the full story, because think of all the wants we have as opposed to the needs we have. Institutions don't have simply to be set up to take care, to cater to our various wants. They must distinguish between wants and needs, and speak to needs, not just to wants. And that is the importance of institutions. And we must feel that our true, rational needs are recognized, acknowledged, and spoken to by institutions. Now, Hegel's claim was that the underlying cause of revolutionary activity was that these conditions weren't met, and that's why the French Revolution occurred in the way it did. If we can just pause for a moment, I'd like you to consider something as we move along in our journey. There's an old metaphysical principle in philosophy. It's that something is better than nothing. Hegel suggests to us that sometimes nothing is better than something. That you could be in a situation where your needs are not acknowledged or recognized. The institutions around you are not speaking to you, and therefore you're in a situation of virtually complete abandonment and alienation. And if in that sense you're not recognized, if in that sense you have nothing, perhaps there's nothing to lose in the radical attempt to change things altogether. Hegel's own notion of freedom is intimately related to notions of liberties and rights. And Hegel's view, a European view, is different than the Anglo-Saxon notions that we typically have of rights and liberties. Hegel thinks that those Anglo-Saxon notions are insufficient. They are important, but they don't tell the full story. If we were to believe Hegel, how the Anglo-Saxon world understands rights are in part as immunities. You have the right not to be interfered with. You have the liberty to be left alone. And Hegel calls that subjective right. He even applauds it in people who have a kind of conscience that's left alone to speak its mind and is not interfered with. But he says, you're not fully free if you're just left alone to say what you want. If you just have the subjective right not to be interfered with, well, of course, it's important to do as you wish, but if there's no supportive context in which you do what you do, then that's not complete freedom. The freedom that you have by being left alone is part of the story, but it needs to be supplemented by something. And what Hegel supplements it by is the notion of an essential human nature that we have. And he thinks that it can be eroded, this essential human nature we have, by various diffuse desires and wants that we might have. We may be lowered by that. Hegel thinks that we have to not just give in to wants and desires. We can't just be left alone. But Hegel also thinks that the objective circumstances, the institutional social circumstances in which we find ourselves, must speak to us. And speak to us in such a way that we experience that we count, that we're acknowledged, that our so-called rational life is understood. And by rational life, Hegel by no means means our reason alone, but our essential life as human beings with cultural hopes, with religious feelings, with a sense that we need participation in a social and political order that is a little greater than we have when we're just left alone to do what we want. Let's consider further, in maybe a full positive sense, freedom has got to involve the recognition of our rightful place in an order that does truly and fully acknowledge us. But how do we get such an order? How does that happen? Hegel has an unusual account of how governments, states are generated, and he emphasizes how important they are in human life. Hegel says, for example, that you can't be fully human without a stable governmental, social context, and that it's very important to understand how such a context comes about. He says that something that's called the social contract theory doesn't explain how a state comes about. It's insufficient. You'd have to have already a stable context for people then to sit down and work out rules about how they're going to get along with each other. But how does the stable context first emerge? You just don't have a situation where people sit down and work things out, because already there must be stability presupposed to do that. Well, then Hegel thinks, what about a contractarian theory? I mean, maybe there can be contracts among groups of people. But he says, no, that isn't the way states could come about either. They couldn't come about that way because there has to be some pre-existing legal nexus. You couldn't use contracts or the social contract theory. Well, we now have a problem. Hegel says that you need the context of a state to flourish, but he doesn't quite yet explain how it comes to flourish. And the answer he gives should worry us. It should worry us as individuals that live our lives in the world, that see life as a journey, and wonder if life has a meaning. Because Hegel says that states are the result of coercive activities. He thinks that particular individuals have illustrious powers, magnetic, almost charismatic powers, that create a stable context in which life can be lived. And because you need the state in which to live life, your duties to the state that allows you to live a full life are more important than your rights within that state. And that, to some, of course, is somewhat a frightening notion. Hegel says that the very notion of freedom, the very notion of rights, are the rights of human beings. But human beings can only exist within the context of a state. This is a problem. This is something that we need to think carefully about. Is this true? Is it true that a stable context is needed? Is it true that our duties within such a stable context are deeper and more important than any rights we might have? Hegel sounds like someone who some call a statist, who puts the state ahead of the individual. His way of explaining this would be to say, full freedom isn't just being left alone. It's having a context in which to flourish. But you pay a real price for that. Generally, Hegel has, and this is a Hegel who is 20 and 25 years into his successful career. This is a Hegel that now doesn't talk so much about the life of the Spirit, doesn't talk so much about the unfolding of the divine consciousness, doesn't talk so much about the struggles, the conflicts, the bringing of a dead life to full life. Hegel, at this later stage in his career, thinks, or at least this is what he's accused of, that maybe the journey of life at a certain point is complete. We have found ourselves in a stable context. Maybe even, and this is what Hegel's successors say, and they sneer at him about it, maybe it's a life of that strange thing called a professor in a middle-class society, a commercial society where you can buy and sell. And it's a society that has rationally based laws, and objective rights are in place and are acknowledged. And we all see that our actions can, should, and will be in accordance with them. Hegel even goes further in this direction. He says you got to have private property. That's because you can't be a full person without private property, and you couldn't be fully recognized unless you could recognize yourself as having it and others recognize you as having it. Well, this begins to look like what? Hegel's accusers say he's sold out. Hegel, the great adventurer of the spirit, who had claimed to know the journey of life as knowing the great ideas and reliving them in the mind. Hegel, who thought of struggle, now seems to be a Hegel who says we got to have the state, we have duties to it, and it must have a certain structure that though it supports us, underlying it all, that's where our duties are. Has Hegel sold out? Or has Hegel just realized that when we're young, we adventure, we take risks, we take on things that are unusual, and looking back at them, maybe they even frighten us that we did them. But then we have the older Hegel who says, well, now we've got the journey somewhat completed, and here we are living the full life. And the full life for Hegel is one in a full society. So the young Hegel, if not radical, adventuresome, caught up in process, life is courageous adventure. And the political tendencies, some thought of that young Hegel, were to the left. And he wanted to transcend all kinds of things, including institutional religion. But now the established Hegel, 20 years later, having left behind him this grand vision of a dynamic life, becomes very conservative in disposition. The emphasis is on the system. The political tendencies tend to go right of center, and Hegel wants to conserve gains and celebrate what is. We're going to be looking as we move forward at a distinction between ideas that come out of the early Hegel, ideas of a dynamic process of development, a celebration of, for instance, the French Revolution, as overturning certain institutions to liberate the human spirit. And then we're going to be looking at reactions. Based on celebrations of that early Hegel, we're going to be looking at reactions to that by people who look at this Hegel who comes up 20 years later. Maybe by then he's a full professor. Time for change is over. What we've got to do is get these young Turks in place. Where everything's got to fall in line is with the establishment. And Hegel tells all of us, perhaps it's with great celebration, that he, the professor in Prussia, in Berlin, has looked around Prussian society, and it's actually captured the way things ought to be. Well, then some people will view the young Hegel as adolescent, others as having a vision that he got older, he sold out. And some will view the older Hegel as sober and realistic. After all, when you're young, life is a journey. You can look for its meaning. When you get tenure and a full professorship, those problems are over. And you look to the establishment to conserve and preserve things for you. But look now where we stand. Look at the route we've taken so far, because we're about to make still another transition. We've looked at rational Kant. We can't know how things are. We must use our reason, but we can't know how things are, and we'll live morally in terms of reason. Then we've looked at the Romantics. We must look beyond the rational to the non-rational. And we've looked at Hegel, who says, well, on the one hand, history has been a grand adventure. We can understand it in some ways, relive it, if only in our minds and imaginations. And we've looked now just very recently at a Hegel who says, well, if the institutions around you support you in a certain way, you've arrived. But in all of our talk, we have not concentrated quite yet on the notion of the self. Who is this self that might use reason? This self that might become romantic and use creativity? This self in history? Who is this self that struggles? Who looks for the meaning of life? Who is on the journey? It is the notion of self that we will look at next.